In today's short lecture, I will be discussing the concept of biophilic design. I will try to discuss it in the simplest way possible, of course without watering it down beyond what would be generally acceptable. It is believed that many years ago, man lived a life where he directly depended on nature without the need to significantly manipulate the natural systems. But with the advent of agriculture, that is the domestication of plants and also animals, and with the shift from nomadic lifestyles to settlements, the connection of man and nature loosened gradually until they could no longer be considered as one. And since then, the linkage has never been re-established, and I do not think that it will ever be. It, however, seems that the knife that was cutting between man and nature did not cut deep enough, at least not deep enough to cut or rewire the deepest parts of what makes us us. And so generations and generations and generations later, in our DNA, there seems to be an imprint of that connection with nature and the love we have for nature. And I think this is the best point to introduce the first key phrase in this discussion, that is biophilia, which is basically the tendency of humans to be attracted to nature. And in its most rudimentary interpretation, biophilia is basically the love for living things. But as we will soon see, since these living things are not only situated in an environment, but are also part of that environment, we generally talk of attraction to nature instead. The Japanese have been famous for miniaturization of nature in living areas, and a good example is Tsuboniwa. This is the Japanese courtyard garden that is common in machiya townhouses. A typical machiya will be surrounded by neighboring buildings on all sides, screening or meaningful interaction with nature such as plants and weed, the temperature change, the smell of soil, etc. But the garden really espouses the Japanese effort to bring nature into living areas despite the space constraints. So with subdued greens and browns in both the architecture and the garden, Tsuboniwa is thus an elegant incorporation of greenery as an element of restoration. That is for the hosts. And it's also a pleasant surprise to the curious guest. It's a kind of a treasure find, since it is often hidden in the most extreme layer of the property. So these natural elements in Tsuboniwa are not mere rootless representations of nature, but you will hear emphasis of the place where the stone was born. And for the trees, you will hear about the names of forests, the ancestors and cousins of the younglings that we get in commercial nurseries. And in this regard, you can see that there is an additional sense of carrying placeness and rewiring memories and recreating familiar scenes. Biophilic design is thus an approach to stimulate the intrinsic biophilia of the person in a built environment. And we can emulate nature in many ways by designing our built environment in a way that best arouses our biophilia, so that we can reap the benefits that come with the interaction with nature. And these benefits include reduced stress and fatigue, which cumulatively, of course, leads to higher productivity, better health, better mood, and other advantages. And most of the time when we hear of biophilic design, we tend to think about forms and patterns of leaves, snail skeletons, and so on. And as much as these are part of biophilic design, it's merely the tip of the colossal extent of biophilic design. I tend to classify biophilic design strategies into 5. And the first one is basically nature via the senses, like the seeing, hearing, smelling, touching. And the second one is natural patterns. Third one is natural spatialities. The fourth one is nature's placeness. And the fifth one is natural systems. The fifth one, as you will see, is a bit sugared with maybe with too much hope and optimism. But in our world of virtual and augmented reality, it doesn't hurt much to imagine a little. The first category is nature via the senses. So imagine you've been working for 4 straight hours in the office and you walk to the large window and take a view of the distant forest. Or you decide to walk downstairs to the cafe, and as you go there, you stop to listen to the sounds of the water feature at the entrance. You also decide to take some photos of the early orchid flowers. That's biophilic design you are enjoying. You might also decide to go to the cafe through an entrance that's designed like a cave, black and dark, and the roof or the ceiling lights being kind of like constellations of small lights. And that might take you to a big expanse that is the cafe, which has a lot of furniture and walls that are made using wood. And so you're able to again experience biophilic design through sight. This small journey really encompasses how we can experience biophilic design via the senses, hearing the sound of water, seeing plants, smelling flowers, etc. The second category is natural patterns. And natural patterns and the forms that they produce are generally organic in nature. And biophilic design strategies in this category use natural materials such as wood and stone, as well as mimicry of natural elements. And examples include the use of wood grain in furniture and fittings, decorative elements that imitate leaves and animals, and also structural elements such as columns inspired by trees. And additionally, you can use artificial objects such as steel, but with complex patterns that are rich in information, and that produce the feeling of natural settings. The third category is natural spatialities, and by spatialities, we are simply talking about the quality of a space. So think, for example, of how the space is organized in terms of depth, of how enclosed or open the space is. So in natural settings, the differences in environmental environments gradually will depend on abiotic factors such as the geology of the place, the climate, the hydrology. But these abiotic factors also determine the living things in an area, and together they determine the spatiality of the environment. So an example of the impact of spatialities in nature is expressed in Appleton's prospect refuge. And the idea behind the prospect refuge theory is that people generally feel most comfortable and safe when they have great visual opportunities while being safe. And just like in natural settings where the predator must be able to see their prey without being seen. And prospect areas are generally open and often bright and are often elevated. They offer the opportunity for someone to be aware and feel safe. Examples of prospect areas in the built environment include balconies, observatories, and watchtowers, and also in a way, an open floor plan with low partitions and rooms that have big windows also fall into this category. For refuge, this includes spaces that have limited visual access, spaces that allow the person to feel safe while having a connection to the larger space. And examples of spaces here include caves and library boards, and which are places where you have a perceived safety and privacy. The fourth category is nature's placeness. And so the question here is, how do we celebrate the places we know? And how do we create buildings that really respect the ground that they stand on? And biophilic strategies in this category get space users to feel a sense of familiarity with geography and to celebrate crafts that have a link to familiar places, to familiar ecology, to familiar geology and climate of places. Additionally, you can have art and photos that can connect people to familiar places. So it is important to integrate a building into geological features through views of mountains, caves, and valleys, as well as orientation with regards to sunlight, to slopes, and to wind. And the idea is not only to connect people with the spirit of the place the building stands, but to kind of reconnect you with places of the past and also places that are far away. The final category is natural systems, and in biophilic design, emulating nature also involves the underlying systems that make nature work the way it works. And I introduced this as a separate category because it largely lies in the realm of things that are not easily perceptible. So it's about the strategies that can make our built environment function better and more sustainably, but inspired by nature. For example, the application of the circular economy in the built environment is inspired by the fact that there is no waste in nature. More like, how can we design buildings and landscapes and building materials such that what comes as waste from one process or from one building is input in the next process. Another example would be for decades, researchers have been pondering about communication among plants, and it seems that the mycorrhizal fungi drew attachment to roots as a symbiotic relationship with trees, whereby in addition to getting carbohydrates from trees and helping trees to better absorb water and nutrients, it acts as a way of communication because it spreads widely underground, and so it forms a kind of network or Wi-Fi among trees, whereby it can give advance warning to a tree based on what is happening to another tree. For example, with regard to tree diseases. So are we likely to have this kind of communication between or among buildings and infrastructure in the future? This one we wait, but there is a lot of potential in that direction. Additionally, we know that birds tend to fly in V-shaped structure so that when they flap their wings, they create a kind of updraft of energy for the next bird in the structure. So the bird that is flying behind is able to reduce the amount of energy it spends on flying. And this level of biophilic design, where we would be inspired by plants and animals in terms of processes, involves collaboration. And you cannot achieve this level of biophilic design alone. It also takes us to the question of how we can graduate from merely biophilic buildings into the idea of biophilic cities. And the biophilic city would be more about the interrelationships between buildings rather than the individual buildings. And as we know that nature is an ecosystem, and this entire system produces ecosystem services that are good for and services for us people, for plants and for animals. And so buildings and landscapes in the built environment could potentially create systems that synergize each other. Still, there is a lot of untouched ground that hold big fortunes for the future of research and practice in biophilic design. But some interesting but small ground has been covered so far in terms of organic forms and patterns. And for example, 3D printing is very promising in this area. And another one is AI, which is an interesting thing to look out for in terms of communication between buildings, landscapes, and other urban infrastructure. In conclusion, we have seen that there's always been an adventure to reconnect man and nature. And nature speaks to itself and to us. And the more we understand how to pick what it's saying, the better we will be in applying biophilic design in the built environment. Sometimes it's a warning from nature. Sometimes it's an offer to share, to eat, to indulge. But whatever the communication is, every signal that nature sends to us is meaningful. And just like a book, we have to understand the language of nature, how to read it, how to interpret the concepts, and how to infuse those principles into our built environment. So far, we have also seen that biophilic design is more than just mimicking the shapes and patterns that are found in nature. It is also not limited to living things, but extends to the general interactions of elements in the biophysical environment. So we have even gone further into considering relationships that are cultural or spiritual in nature, whose imprints may only be perceptible in very individual specific ways due to a person's relationship with a specific space. In terms of implementation, each of the 5 categories has a specific implementation potential and challenges. And for example, including elements of sound and smell and sight or other senses is relatively easier. You can just have a potted plant in your space, and that's biophilic. However, when it comes to patterns, we need more caution, because the more complex or the more diverse elements we are using in a space, the more we risk falling into a visual cacophony in a space, which would end up having more disadvantages than the advantages we are looking for. In terms of natural spatialities, we require greater structural considerations in a building, and so that's a major impediment. And since placeness is very individual specific, it is a challenge to create collective memory or to celebrate it among people who are from different origins, different cultures, and different lifestyles. And finally, the most complex of all is mimicking natural system, because this requires more resources and collaboration between different entities, and the existing technologies are not yet up to task, and so there's still a lot to look out for.